So you want to start running. So over the last 4 or 5 years, or realistically since the COVID lockdowns, there's been a massive increase in people's interest in running, particularly the people who are coming to our user groups. So I'm not talking about traditional kind of field sports athletes. I'm not talking about people who want to do a triathlon. What I'm talking about is people who like lifting weights, weightlifters, powerlifters, or just recreational strength training people who also want to do a bit of running. So 10 or 12 years ago, there was actually a big anti-cardio movement in these user groups. People who lifted weights were worried that cardio was going to kill their gains in some way. I know many of you who are pretty recent to the game might think this is some sort of a meme and that people actually didn't believe it, but this was definitely believed by most people in these user groups. When we saw people running and squatting, or running and just generally trying to lift weights and be bigger, they were oftentimes laughed at or just pushed over into the CrossFit category. But now, thankfully, there's been a bit of a change in tone. People understand that although they want to have more muscle and they want to look good, they'd also like to be a bit more aerobically fit, whether it's to be healthier or just to not be quite so out of breath when you're running for the bus. Generally speaking, people are trying to fit into both of these groups. And look, I completely agree. There's nothing better than feeling fit. There's nothing better than having a good 5K or 10K time, or just being able to join in on your kid's football match outside your house. I understand why people want to have better cardio, and it also helps you lose some weight. Now, the problem is, if you haven't run in quite a while, or maybe you're carrying a bit more extra weight than you'd ideally be for getting good run times, you can't just do the Forrest Gump approach and start running. So today, what we're going to do is talk about what group you might be falling into and how you should best start running. So the first thing we have to talk about for every user group is this idea of body prep. So the same way where the first time I come to the gym, I might be well able to rack a barbell and do good quality strict press. If you haven't run in a while, your body's just not going to be prepared for running. Many of us think about run training as a predominantly aerobic adaptation style. So I'm going to run, I'll get fitter, my blood values will improve, my cardiovascular health will improve. But if you're just getting started into this kind of training, the cardio side of things really isn't where most of the prep should be done. Most of the prep should be done on the musculoskeletal system. So what my muscles are like, what the tendons and ligaments are like, and how well I'm going to be able to maintain good positions without coming across things like shin splints, getting sore knees, getting sore ankles, and just not being able to continue running for more than 2 or 3 weeks. When we look at muscles, firstly, the main muscles that you're going to have to prep and get ready for running are the calves. So we have the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and the tibialis anterior. So all of these muscle groups are going to work together basically to hold our foot in a good position throughout the entirety of the run. When we do things like squats, we're commonly thinking about maintaining a good position for somewhere between 1 and 10 reps. The problem is when we go on longer runs, we're looking at thousands of steps where we have to maintain good positions throughout. Although the contractions mightn't be quite as hard, they're going to have to be maintained for a very long time. For many of us, if we haven't run in quite a while, those muscle groups just won't be well conditioned to maintain that slightly plantar flex position throughout the entirety of our strides. So if you imagine for the first 100 meters, you're going to be able to maintain this good springy position with the foot, with the heel staying elevated from the floor and not slamming down onto the ground. But once we start getting into the longer distances and we start getting a bit more fatigued, gradually we'll lose that position and our heel will start to strike out in front of us. Now, the great news is this prep work is very simple, almost too simple to the point where many people won't do it. Very simple single skips with a rope, or just doing some basic plyometrics on and off a plate will all help build that conditioning within the calves and the tibialis anterior to make sure we're going to maintain that foot in a good position to then stop us having the big impacts on the ground, to hopefully then alleviate that risk of getting sore knees, sore shins, sore ankles, and just allow us to run a small bit more efficiently. The problem you're going to run into here is that most of us spend a lot of our day in positions similar to this. My ankle is at 90 degrees. I'm never really holding it in that plantar flex position. And so gradually the muscles of my calves will start to lengthen out and lose mobility. And I just won't have that same springiness within the tendon. When we're looking to build that kind of capacity within the tendons, muscles, and ligaments around our leg, our ankles, and our knees, we also need to be conscious that there are some tendons and ligaments will just take a little bit longer to adapt. What I'm talking about here specifically is the tendons around our foot and the ligaments around our foot that might start to get inflamed once you start into your first 3 or 4 weeks of running. In this case, if we start to get this kind of inflammation or repetitive strain style injury within the foot, the ankle, the knee, we should just take a little break from training, make sure we properly address it and why it's happening, and then go forward with the rest of the program. All of this comes down to one super basic point. If you haven't run in a while, if you haven't jumped or landed in a while, you can't immediately go into a running program and expect to have good results or expect to be able to do it immediately for a prolonged period of time. If you want the best best results possible, make sure you're preparing your body to go through these repetitive style movements, and this will allow the best possible chance of success for at least 3-4 months of a training block. Once we've gone beyond that preparation exercise period, then for the first few weeks where we're just doing some basics, skipping, jumping, hopping and landing, we need our starting phase of run training. The ideal starting phase of run training is very controlled intervals. Now, I want to just put a mark in the sand at this point of there are a lot of people who just go out and immediately start running 5Ks or 3Ks and gradually start to increase the pace at which they're running those 5Ks and 3Ks. That can work, and for many people it is the preferred option, but there's a very specific reason that I prefer to do intervals first. Using intervals first is drastically superior than using a longer run and gradually trying to increase your pace, because it ensures quality of stride and quality of running. When we go for those longer runs and we gradually start to increase our pace, we're going from a quality of running that tends to be quite poor, so a lot of heel striking, a lot of poor positions, a lot of inefficient running style. If we go to intervals first, we're only doing 200 meters, 400 meters, 800 meters, and we can maintain very high quality running type and then gradually increase the distance as we become more aerobically fit. The main thing I want you thinking about here is I don't want you lumbering around like some out of shape person, which you probably are, but I want you to be running with good strides, good mechanics, getting that same fitness stimulus we're going to be getting from those longer style runs, but we're training ourselves to be better, faster and more efficient runners. So no matter what point you're at in your running journey, if you ran a lot before or you're incredibly unfit now, I want you to focus on good mechanics to start, and there are 4 key points to good running mechanics. For ease of explanation and memory here, we're going to start from the floor and move up. So when we're looking at the floor, what I'm really looking at is where my foot is going to be striking the ground and how I'm cycling through each step. For this type of running, when you're just getting back into it, I want you to imagine your foot is going to impact the ground directly under your hips. So no matter what you're doing, I'm going to work to impact the ground straight underneath where my hip is. This is going to make sure I'm not striking the ground out in front of me, but also that I'm not driving into a sprinting position immediately. The second thing then is just the position the foot is in throughout this ground contact. When I'm making contact with the ground, I just want to imagine an egg underneath my heel. So I'm never going to allow my heel to strike and then pull through. Rather, I'm going to stay on the ball of my foot. Even when I'm just at standard running pace, I want to make sure I'm not collapsing down on that heel. The third thing then is very specific to the stronger groups here, and that is the running style of a muscle-bound runner. Generally speaking, the running style of the more muscled individuals tends to be quite clunky and awkward. For want of a better term, it looks like a tiny pony trying to run really fast. They just look very lumbered as they're trying to move through their stride. There tends to be 2 reasons for this. Firstly, they don't tend to have the same level of rotation, keeping their upper body stationary as their feet are running through those strides. But secondly, as they're cycling their leg back around through that stride, they never bring their heel back close to their ass. So they're not getting a full running stride. Mostly they end up running with almost straight legs, which leads to this kind of side to side lumbering running style. If you're in that running group, you can get a slightly more efficient and better running style. One of the main ways you'll do it is through gaining mobility. So gaining mobility, particularly in the anterior hip flexors, but also in the quads, to allow us to have a better running stride will make a big difference. It will also stop your lower back and hips getting quite so tight, sore and tired by the end of your longer runs. Fourth and finally then, I want you to think about being more like Tom Cruise and less like Napoleon Dynamite. The coordination of swinging our arms as we're going through a good running stride is something that people might just take a little bit of time to get used to. To keep it very simple, think about maintaining a 90-degree bend in your elbow throughout that entire running stride, and then think about going from cheek to cheek here. It doesn't need to be massively complicated. There are definitely very specific cues you can use for different types of running, but generally speaking, just having a better arm drive is going to maintain our torso angle, going to make us much more efficient and allow us to maintain good stride length throughout the entirety of our runs without slowly, gradually moving towards a decrepitous, terrible running style. The last thing here then is that many people will see this style of running and hear these cues and say, well, that actually sounds a lot like sprinting, and my 5K would never look like that. In fact, this is not sprinting. Sprinting is very different from this. What you're really confusing this with is it's not jogging. When we're jogging, a lot of the time people are kind of lumbering around. This is where a lot of those big repetitive strain injuries start occurring. We start getting getting shin splints, we start getting sore knees, sore ankles, sore hips, and sore back, because there's so much of this bouncy type impact throughout the entirety of the jog. When we want to get into running and when we're going to use intervals to get there, we'll focus on good form, make sure we're moving as good as we possibly can, with the aim of gradually moving that gradually further and further into our distances at better and better paces. So for us, running is around 65 to 75% of our max pace. It's nowhere near sprinting. It makes sure we don't have a heel strike at any point during our stride, and it is one of the most effective training tools if you want to get better cardio. Look, I know there's a lot of you might want to do the kind of ultra distance stuff, and certainly you're not going to be using that style of stride. There's also a group of you who are going to be doing sprinting alongside your weight training, but for most of us, you're running for the sake of getting a bit fitter and allowing you to have slightly better running times. In that case, these are going to be absolutely perfect, and they give you a really low barrier for entry to start getting into some of that more cardio style training. So we know how we're going to prepare our body to do some running training. We know what the initial phase of training is going to look like, and we know what our running style should look like when we start doing it. But the next part I want you to do is just have a little chat with yourself. A lot of people start off these journeys without ever really thinking, why do I want to do this? They might just see a random thing online and say, oh, I'd love to start running, and start headfirst running into one of these training blocks without having any real goals in mind. You might have seen Zach Delander doing some running on his Instagram and think this is a cool thing to do, so I'm going to do it. You might know you need to lose some weight and just think this is a good way to burn a few extra calories. Or you might just want to be in slightly better physical condition or aerobic condition so you don't feel as out of breath walking up the stairs in the office. All of these things are valid goals or valid things to want, but I'm not taking the piss when I say you have to just sit down and have a 5-minute chat. The major issue here is an issue of congruence. We see an outcome that we think comes from running, and then we just start to set that as a goal and use running as the tool without ever really relaying both of these things across onto each other. The problem with many of these goals I've mentioned is they are somewhat directionless. Let's take, for example, using running to lose some weight. Any amount of extra physical activity will help you burn more calories, and so will help you be in a calorie deficit. But just starting headlong into one of these blocks without any real idea for the amount of outcomes you want or the amount of training you need to do is a great way of stifling your progress, because you'll either undershoot the correct amount of work or you'll massively overshoot the amount of work and end up falling out of the block. So you might be saying, well, do I need two goals? Do I need a goal to lose weight and then I need a corresponding running goal to go alongside it? Well, no, that's not strictly right. What you actually need here is to set a slightly different type of goal, and this is known as a process goal. Generally speaking, in S&C circles, we talk about outcome goals: a weight we want to lift, a time we want to run, or the amount of weight we want to lose. But these are all very specific to an outcome and don't really keep us on track with the general process of how we're going to achieve it. The alternative, as I mentioned, is a process goal, and this is much more keeping you in line for those 10, 12, 16 weeks you're going to be in a training block for. Let's say, for example, the weight loss and running goal we spoke about earlier, where you know you want to lose 10 kilos and you know you want to do running to get there. A great way of setting that goal will be a minimum amount of running training you're going to do per week, which ensures we're going to burn more calories, ensures we're staying on track, but isn't necessarily tied into an exact weight on the scales. Now, I understand, right? This isn't perfect either, because mileage on the road doesn't necessarily immediately equate to the amount of weight you're going to lose, but it does keep you a hell of a lot more on track than just being a headless chicken running around the place. So look, I get it. There's a lot of ways of skinning the cat when it comes to losing weight and running, or getting a small bit fitter and running, but I want you to just understand that you can have a process-led goal that will keep you on track and make sure you're doing the right things throughout the entire training block. If you have listened to the first half of this video and you think this sounds really great, I've no idea where to start though, check out the Sika Strength app and check out the track running conditioning program. This is 2 interval sessions per week, really nicely progressed over the course of 8 weeks. This will give you a great starting place for your running training. Moving on from the weight loss group then and looking at the people who just want better cardio, this is a very valid goal, and running is one of the best ways to get there. Whether you want to have better cardio for recovering more easily in between your sets of squats, thus allowing you to get higher weight in for those volume squats. Maybe you want better cardio because you don't want to spend 2.5 hours in the gym as you have to wait 2.5 minutes in between each of your accessory pieces. Or maybe you just want better cardio so you can run a small bit without feeling so out of breath. Running is one of the sharpest tools we have to getting better cardio, but it obviously comes with some caveats and some things we need to be aware of. When we're looking to use running as a cardio tool, a heart rate monitor or some way of measuring our heart rate throughout workouts is your best friend here. In cardio, you're really training your heart, and so many people are going into a cardio session like they would go into a weights training session without having the weights written on the barbell or on the plates they're going to use. We have to understand what our heart rate is doing if we want to make sure we're working in the correct brackets to get better cardio. So look, there's a million different cardio pieces you can do. There's a million different ways of scheduling zone 2, zone 3, and zone 4 cardio workouts. What I really want you to be aware of though is just having some bit of a plan here. To give you a great example of a plan would be something like Norwegian 4x4. This is just a simple interval session where you're going to push your heart rate to 90% and hold it for 4 minutes, and then you have 3 minutes of just a low heart rate kind of trudging through the rest of the session. You simply do this 4 times, 10-minute warm up at the start, 10-minute cool down at the end. Gives you a very, very effective training session. It's been used by everybody from pensioners all the way through to Olympic athletes with great success. And the most important thing is it gives you structure. You understand what your heart is doing during those sessions because you're monitoring your heart rate for the entire session. Now, please don't get me wrong here. There is no magic with that 4x4 workout. There's nothing special going on here in terms of physiology. It's just a structure that tends to work quite well for many people at many different levels of training. And it's a way of just ensuring you're getting a really good high quality workout done. It does lack a certain amount of intricacy in terms of adjusting those intensities as we build from week to week. Obviously, there's no clear way of progressing that. And in many cases, when we go into slightly more advanced cardio training, we will tweak those variables slightly by getting slightly higher intensities for slightly longer periods of time. But starting off, the 4x4 is going to be perfect. Now, don't get me wrong here, there is absolutely nothing special about that Norwegian 4x4. There's no magic physiology going on behind the scenes here. It's just a good structure that most people can stick to that gets a really good training effect done. It does lack a certain amount of progression and regression. We can't really tweak those variables too much from week to week. And if we're doing it over the course of 6 or 8 months, it's gonna get quite tiresome because we're not really seeing any clear progression. But what I want you to understand is just having structure around those sessions is so valuable. Once you start getting into more higher level cardio training, you can certainly look to tweak those things like the intensity, the time period at which you're holding those heart rates for, and the amount of sessions you're going to do that per week. But right now, starting off with some running, the 4x4 is going to be brilliant. The final group then is the group that is most at risk of overtraining and properly injuring themselves while using running, and that is people who use running as a stress relieving exercise. Running is phenomenal for clearing your head. It's why so many people enjoy it. Just that 20 minutes or that hour where they're out on the road on their own, working hard, breathing heavy. But this is a massively risky group to be in, and you need to be aware of a couple of things. Running's great as a psychological aid. It can allow your nervous system to really focus on one thing. It can allow your kind of psychology to just focus on that physical exertion and forget about whatever else is going on. For some other people then, it can just give them that hour to think to themselves, to be in their own head, to really concentrate on tasks or projects they're working on. But the problem is when we're using running as a psychological aid, we cannot necessarily equate the same amount of running values to calories as we would for weight loss, or the amount of heart rate work we do at certain intensities to increase in cardiovascular health, because those two things, the amount of running we're doing and the amount of stress relief we get from it, never really cross over or never really equate from one to the other. The problem here is our stress is not always linear. We don't necessarily always have more stress towards the end of the week when we're more tired. We don't always have the same amount of stress from task to task or from week to week. And the relative reaction of those stress levels within ourselves to the exercise we're going to use to help treat it is almost never the same. This eventually leads to people chasing the dragon, going for longer runs at higher intensities, hurting themselves more and more as they're trying to get that same stress relief as they might have gotten from the first few years of running. And this is where a massive amount of those repetitive strain injuries, those shin splints, those disordered eating habits start to come in, where we keep pushing ourselves harder because we're getting more stressed, and then because we're getting more stressed, we're not necessarily getting the same level of stress relief. So here are some super simple things I want you to do if you're using running for some stress relief, or that's one of the reasons you like to run. Look, I get it. A lot of you will feel like the roof is on fire and it's raining outside, but you can't use running to get away from your problems. I know it gives us both psychological and geological distance from our problems many times. It gives us an hour away, a half an hour away, but if you're using it to get distance from those problems, please stop. It is not a good psychological coping mechanism to run away, both literally and figuratively, from your problems. So just have a simple rule in your head. If everything's done, if the tasks are mostly taken care of, even if they're just the high priority tasks, then you allow yourself to run. But if you still have high priority tasks to do, or there's still very important things you haven't taken care of, let's not go for that longer run. Now, number two is getting some other positive coping mechanisms in place. I get it, right? Saunas and ice baths might not be for everyone. Meditation or mindfulness might not be for everyone, but let's just get something in place that helps relieve some of the stress so all of that pressure isn't going on running or or incredibly hard training. It could also be something as simple as taking 5 minutes at the start of a training session or end of a training session to kind of organize your space and get everything in order for the next day. Or it might be writing down tasks you completed or tasks you have to do the next day before you go to bed. Any of these things are going to be positive psychological coping mechanisms, and as I said earlier, they just take some of the load away from all the physical activity. The final rule then should be, if you're sore, tight, or tired, and you're starting to get any of those repetitive style injuries, any sort of pain aside from standard muscle soreness that's coming from training, if any of that is rearing its head, you're not allowed to run. This is one of the best ways to safeguard yourself against this massive overtraining, by using training as a psychological tool. It won't hold you back. I know it might feel like you're stopping training for maybe one session every 2 weeks, but this is going to make sure you're able to stay on track in the long run. I hope today's video was useful for you. If you'd like to see some other training programs like the interval running program on the app, check out app.sikastrength.com. You can also message myself and Owen directly here through the coach bot. It's nothing like an AI chatbot. You actually just message us directly and we'll give you an answer as soon as possible.